What is up, you guys? This is JP coming at you with another video. Today's topic is going to be how much does intensity matter for hypertrophy and strength. A couple videos ago, I did a video titled how much does volume matter. I'm pretty much going to go over every exercise trait or variable that you can manipulate and talk about how much does it matter in the grand scheme of things in regards to hypertrophy and strength. Today's video is going to be about workout intensity. Now, to preface this video, there's two forms of intensity. Intensity in regards to percentage of 1 rep max, how heavy you're going. So if your 1 rep max to keep the number simple, if your 1 rep max on bench press is 100 pounds, intensity in regards to how much of a percentage you're lifting in regards to your 1 rep max. So 80 pounds would be 80% of your 1 rep max if your 1 rep max was 100 pounds. Now, another definition for intensity is proximity to failure. So how close you get to failure. So for example, if you did 80% 1 rep max on a bench press, again, which would be 80 pounds if your 1 rep max was 100 pounds, and you only did 1 repetition, the intensity in regards to 1 rep max would be pretty high because 80% is relatively heavy. But because you only did one repetition, your intensity in regards to proximity to failure, how close you get to failure, wouldn't be that high, because I think 80% 1 rep max estimates to about, I think, like 6 to 7 reps, something like that. So first we'll talk about hypertrophy. So intensity talking about percentage of 1 rep max, so how heavy. For hypertrophy, it matters, but it's not that important, at least in regards to hypertrophy. So many studies have shown that you can make gains in muscle mass, in hypertrophy, how much gains you make in muscle mass, even with pretty light loads. The threshold that we know right about now for the data that we do have is around 30% of 1 rep max. So using that same example I said earlier, if your 1 rep max for a bench press is 100 pounds, the cutoffs for where that even training to failure doesn't make up for the fact that you're training so light is around 30% of 1 rep max, or using that example, would it be about 30 pounds. So again, there is a such thing as going too light in regards to hypertrophy. So you can go too light, but most people, if you're training in the gym, you're not gonna be going that light. I mean, 30% of 1 rep max, I think, is about, if you were to take 30% of 1 RM, that equates to about, I think, about 40 reps. You could somewhere 40 to 50 reps around there. So unless you're training with a load that light, you don't really have to matter. Now, at the same time, if you're going too heavy and your main goal is hypertrophy, you have to understand is that if you're going too heavy, you're not gonna be able to do that many reps. So if you're training way above 80% 1 rep max, let's just say you're working with 85% of 1 rep max, that equates to, I think, around like a 5 rep max or something like that. That's gonna actually have a lot of factors. One, it's gonna make it hard to accumulate volume. And if you watch my previous video on how much does volume matter, you'll know that volume dictates the magnitude of adaptation in regards to hypertrophy. So if most of your work is in the high percentages of 1 rep max, or essentially if most of your work is training with really heavy loads, you're not gonna be accumulating that much volume. You're gonna have to do a lot of sets to make up for the low amount of reps that you're doing per set. But again, for anyone who's trained a lot, if you're doing a lot of sets of heavy work, that's a quick way to, 1, get injured, and 2, have poor recovery, which again, if you don't recover, that leads to worse gains over the long run. So it's that, middle rep ranges, which leads to those middle percents of 1 rep max that matter, that you really want to kind of stick to. Now, in regards to proximity of failure for hypertrophy, again, the main aspect there is, 1, if you're training too far from failure, you're not recruiting all the muscle fibers in whatever muscle you're training, which means that all those muscle fibers are not getting stimulated. If a muscle fiber is not getting stimulated, it's not gonna have a reason to get broken down for you to go home, eat, sleep, and recover for it to actually hypertrophy, because that's just what hypertrophy means, is for a muscle fiber to get bigger, to grow. On the alternative though, if you're too close to failure for hypertrophy, if you're too close to failure, you're going to be inhibiting recovery too much. So even though you might be maximizing recruitment of all muscle fibers and stimulation of all those muscle fibers, if you're constantly training to failure, that's just going to lead to you having poor recovery. So in regards to proximity to failure, there is a sweet spot there too. So you do want to be able to maximally stimulate all those muscle fibers, but you got to think about recovery as well. So now in regards to strength, this is where strength differs. When we're talking intensity in regards to percentage of 1 rep max, it's all about specificity when it comes to strength. If you want to get stronger in an exercise, you want to be able to lift more weight maximally, you need to be training, a lot of your training should be in those higher percentages of 1 rep max. So whereas hypertrophy is most of your training shouldn't be above 80% of your 1 rep max, I would argue that most of your training should be above 80% of 1 rep max if you're a strength athlete, or if you're someone looking to increase your 1 rep max like a power lifter, for example. So, and that just comes down to the principle of specificity. When you're doing an exercise and you're training heavy, your muscle fibers recruit in a way that optimizes lifting for that rep range. So for example, if you're training in the higher rep ranges, your muscle fibers are going to recruit and fire in unison to lift that load. So the example that I like to use is think about a rowboat. If you have 6 people sitting or 8 people sitting in a rowboat and you're trying to row really fast and get to a place really quick in the rowboat, you're not going to have people alternating rowing when you're trying to get to that destination. If it's a short distance you're trying to go and you're trying to get there fast, you're going to have everyone rowing at the same time. Your muscle fibers kind of work in the same way. If you're lifting very heavy weights for a low amount of repetitions, your muscle fibers are going to learn over time to fire in unison to lift that load. So again, that's what happens is essentially your body has a lot of nervous system adaptations that adapt specifically to heavier loads. So if you're training above 80% of 1 rep max, it happens that way. So for someone training to increase their 1 rep max, or for a strength athlete, you want to be lifting with heavy loads and you want to that's something that you want to be doing, whereas it would be different for training for hypertrophy. Now, in regards to proximity to failure, this is where strength is a little bit different as well. When it comes to strength or increasing your 1 rep max, you don't necessarily need to be as close to failure as you do with hypertrophy. Your goal isn't to maximally stimulate all those muscle fibers. Your goal is to, again, it's just a nervous system adaptation. I like to think of strength as a skill, whereas hypertrophy is just a response to a stimulus. Or I guess it's kind of weird wording because strength is too, but I think that hypertrophy is best thought of as like you're putting your body in an environment and your body is trying to adapt to that specific environment. And again, that environment is to break down the muscle tissue and recover. So when it comes to strength, you don't need to be as close to failure, in my opinion, in looking at the research, as you do with hypertrophy. You could be a little bit further from failure. So for example, strength, you can do things such as singles, doubles, and triples. And you may have seen this in a program. You may have seen someone do a top set, whereas they'll start with a heavy single and then they go into some higher rep work. And that one heavy single will benefit that person a lot in the long run to get stronger. Whereas with hypertrophy, a single really isn't gonna do much because again, you have a lot of muscle fibers that are not maximally being stimulated. And even if you are training with a really heavy load and your body has to recruit a lot of muscle fibers, I just think that's just not enough volume for you to be able to maximize a response in regards to hypertrophy. So again, for strength, I think when it comes to proximity of failure, you don't need to be as close in regards to hypertrophy. So overall, intensity is extremely important. They're different for hypertrophy and different for strength, but it does matter. A lot of intensity, when you think about it, comes down to recovery, comes down to specificity, and it comes down to stimulation and recruitment of muscle fibers. If you're looking at those aspects and then you're putting it into your program in regards to those aspects, then you'll end up coming up with a good program so you can maximize gains. If you guys have any questions, comments, leave them down below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.